Yeah, so we were. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of these assessments in this course are sort of broad, open-ended. Pick a topic that you're interested in and use it as a way to demonstrate that you were paying some attention in class and, and did the readings.
Everyone has a dream, and some people's dreams take them to extraordinary places. David Simon is one of those people. Tune in every quarter to learn how a 50-something lawyer from the U.S. navigates the ancient world of Oxford College in pursuit of an MBA.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with David Simon for A Yank at Oxford, where we're exploring David's exploration of getting an MBA in Oxford. So, David, first of all, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be with you.
So, David, you've now completed, I believe, 2 of your 5 courses, Analytics and Leadership Fundamentals. And so today I wanted to maybe focus on a couple of areas you have focused on over the last, I don't know if term or quarter or module is the right way to phrase it, but firms and markets and government and governance and ethics, because you've taken a look at those, looking at ourselves, at legal firms, at lawyers, and I thought that was not only inspired, but something that would make a great topic, particularly around both areas of decision-making processes and market disruption and what it might mean for the future. So with that, what did you tell us about your leadership fundamentals and how that ended up for you? I know you took what we would call a test, but they call an assessment. What was your sort of final thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah, so we were, I mean, it's interesting. A lot of these assessments in this course are sort of broad, open-ended, pick a topic that you're interested in and use it as a way to demonstrate that you were paying some attention in class and, and did the readings. It's very open-ended, which I guess for me is good. It drives the engineer types in the class crazy because there's like no right answers and no clear direction. But our leadership fundamentals class, and it was we actually took this course over 3 different modules actually. I think it was extended over time and covered a lot of territory. And basically they asked us to pick something that a leadership challenge that we experienced in our careers and, apply some of the frameworks from the course to address the challenge and propose a solution. So I picked sort of part law firm partner, lawyer partner decision making as my leadership challenge. And I kind of focused in on two areas. One was how we typically build and manage an engagement team on a particular matter, which I think is frankly not very good. How we do it, I think there's room for improvement. And then the second piece was how we make decisions in terms of making recommendations to our clients. And we talked a little bit about this, I think, in our last podcast. This notion of, on the decision-making piece, this notion of sort of slowing things down, avoiding bias, cognitive bias that sort of affects how we typically make recommendations. So I kind of delved deeply into both of those topics and proposed some different ways of approaching it. It was really interesting. It was a good exercise for me to kind of pull together what we had learned and focus in on on the material.
So, David, in my private practice, before I went into the corporate world, I was a trial lawyer, and pretty early in my career moved to the first chair, I would say 5 years into my career. And from there on, for the next 20 years, I was the guy. And the guy had 2 really functions. One was to manage the litigation up to the point of trial. Sometimes, if it was a smaller case, I'd do it myself. As cases got bigger, I got a bigger team working under me. And then at trial, to be the point person, to be the advocate at trial. And so in that process, it was really managing the discovery as much as anything. Typically, I knew You had a pretty good idea what the facts were. They weren't something that you had to uncover too much. You tried to use discovery to shade facts in your way. And I was almost always on the defense side, so I was very lucky because if things were bad, well, I just settled the case. And no harm, no foul. And that's what defense lawyers do, and that's why insurance companies exist, and that's why corporations have large litigation departments. But I wanted to maybe ask you about your professional practice. I know you're a white-collar defense lawyer, but have you had some trials or arbitrations or other hearings in front of regulatory bodies, or was it a different type of practice? So I was wondering if you might explain that process, if it differs from really my experience as a trial lawyer.
Yeah, so I actually started on that same path, Tom, when I began my career as a kind of a commercial litigator, and I have had experience, in trials and in arbitration hearings. I kind of pivoted, reasonably early before I became a partner into more of the investigation, white-collar defense, government enforcement defense practice. And part of that representing corporations meant, trial work was a lot less of a critical component of what we did. It was more, we do more of the sort of figuring out the facts through an internal investigation, assessing the exposure, and then more often than not managing that risk with the regulators. So dealing with regulators in terms of defending. In a sense, in an adversarial kind of position, defending the company. But I think a lot of the way we manage investigations or trial work, or really any matter as lawyers, there's a lot of things that we do in common. I think in terms of putting teams together, we're, like I said before, I think we're really not very good at it. I don't think we're very thoughtful about the teams we put together and the roles different people play and the roles that are required. I think our normal on an investigation, and this is probably true for you in a trial too, right? You sort of default to this reflexive, like, okay, well, it's a big investigation or a big case, so we need, a lead partner, and then we're going to need a second chair partner, and then, probably a mid-level associate and a paralegal, or whatever. We think about position more than role. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, for this matter, what are the client's objectives? What do we need to put together in terms of a service delivery team that will that will help us fulfill the client's objectives? So that I think is an area really ripe for improvement in law firms. And I don't know, maybe I can just, I don't want to just ramble on, Tom, but I could talk a little bit about sort of the way I sort of propose dealing with it in my paper. There's some pretty good research on this in terms of team member roles, and there's this framework by a guy named Belden where he talks about 9 different roles in a functioning team, and it's goes from the person who keeps time and makes sure you stay on track to the expert in the subject matter, to someone who brings in the resources from the firm and externally to make sure things get accomplished that need to be accomplished on schedule. So there are all these different roles, and I think normally in a law firm, I don't know what your experience has been, but in mine, the lead partner ends up playing most of the roles of those key 9 roles, and frankly isn't very well suited for most of them. So what I'm proposing in my paper, and just sort of the way I'm thinking about this, is let's stop at the beginning. Think about the engagement. Think about what roles are needed. Think about who from your firm or outside your firm could fulfill those roles, and really build the team around what's required rather than sort of what position people have in the law firm. That's a lot of what I've sort of thought about and wrote about in my assessment.
So in reading that, it really brought back a lot of memories for me about being in a law firm, a managing partner of a law firm, on the management committee of law firms. But it really bled over into your second paper, or the second topic, which was firms and markets assessment. So I wanted to see if maybe we could tie those two together. But before we do, could you tell us what your assignment was and what you delivered on that module?
Yeah, so it was sort of similarly vague, and it was sort of a show us that you learned something in the class kind of an assignment. But what we were asked to do is to pick an industry and do essentially like a market analysis of the industry, and then propose a like a disruptive entry strategy into the industry. So that was basically the assignment. I chose. I sort of defined the market as large U.S. law firms, principally domestic. I sort of carved out the really big global players that have offices everywhere, focusing in on U.S. based clients representing essentially the Fortune 500. That was my market.
So in terms of the market, I guess the other thing that struck me, because I've been thinking about this a lot, seems like to me the market is ripe for disruption. There could be other types of legal service delivery vehicles. We have seen some in the United Kingdom, for instance, allows non-lawyer investment in law firms. Some of the big four accounting firms have developed legal, I'll call them a legal practice, although they can't practice law, but legal advice, I guess, or business advice through a legal lens. I'm not sure what they call it. And then there are firms, consulting firms in the compliance space that are populated by, many of them by lawyers, but they are not practicing because corporations can't practice law. Did you either know that this market was ripe for disruption or sense that from your research?
Yeah, I think so. It's really interesting because as I think most people know, the market that I've sort of defined is incredibly unconcentrated, right? I think the biggest there's not really great data out there on this, but I think the market share of probably the largest firm in our market is like 1.5%. The top 5 firms don't even add up to 5% of the market. So it's super unconcentrated, but it still operates a little bit like an oligopoly. And I think that's largely a function of the regulatory environment you just mentioned, right? So, there are obviously massive barriers to entry. The most fundamental one being required to pass a bar and be admitted to a bar in order to practice, right? That's a barrier to entry. The ownership rules that restrict non-lawyer ownership of law firms is a barrier to entry, and then conflicts rules really prevent serious concentration in the industry. So it's an odd industry that is, I think the regulatory barriers to entry are probably the defining characteristic of it. That's all artificial, right? So I do think it's absolutely ripe for disruption. That disruption, I think, depends on some regulatory reforms or successful challenges to the regulatory structure. And I think a big one is this non-lawyer ownership that you mentioned. There have been some moves in some states to loosen up those rules, and I think that could have a real significant change if that kind of moves forward as a more of an opening. Having sort of private equity ownership, and this is sort of where I spent a lot of my time in terms of outlining a disruption strategy, is sort of a private equity owned law firm where it would be there'd be more investment in technology, more focus on process, more ability to price the services creatively, Probably lower comp. I think high lawyer comp, high partner comp is a big part of what makes the market ripe for disruption. I think there's a demand for, from talented lawyers, maybe for different roles in law firms that aren't partner type roles that would maybe pay less but make up for that lower pay and other benefits. So I think there's something there. I mean, it really depends on, like I said, the regulatory environment being loosened. I suspect it's coming. I also expect that the state bars and the existing structure will fight back hard. This is, to the extent there's going to be change, it's going to be sort of like Uber, fighting the taxi industry. There will be substantial pushback, and any firm that is trying to really disrupt is going to have to be prepared to fight pretty hard.
So now let me see, David, if I could tie these two strands together, because I think in many ways the structure within a law firm is almost the same as when I started nearly 40 years ago. And you articulated it: senior partner, junior partner, senior associate, junior associate, paralegal, legal clerk, maybe even a secretary or librarian stuck in there if it's a big enough project as well. And we've got that internal structure inhibiting some of efficient decision-making process that you've articulated in your paper and you've been studying. But it's overlaid with an industry that is not, or I should say, well, certainly not prone to new ideas or innovation, but largely because of the regulatory structure. There's really no way for a disruptor to come in at this point unless you're just another group of lawyers, and then you're just another firm. And you've got all those characteristics that we've talked about. So, and then we're still kind of stuck with, if not the reality, the mentality of partnership compensation, which is based upon the amount of money you bring in and generate for the firm all the way down that pyramid. So we have an outmoded compensation structure. We have an outmoded decision-making structure, but we're in an industry that, because of the regulatory structure and high barriers to entry, we really can't come in with a new disruption. So I wanted to see if maybe you could tie those together in a way that I haven't been able to. Is there a way, I don't want to say blow the whole thing up, but is there a way to make some innovative inroads within what we currently have?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, Tom, and obviously I am... I continue to be a partner in a big law firm, so the power of the status quo is great. And look, I mean, I think one thing we didn't mention in this that I think ties these things together as well is just the hourly billing aspect, right? Like, I'm talking about trying to build out teams that include perspectives. For instance, like a voice of the client who might be a different lawyer. On a matter. In my kinds of cases where there's a government regulator involved, I think it would be very valuable to always have on your team the voice of the regulator. So maybe a different person, someone who brings that perspective. And pretty soon when you add that up with the project assistant and the voice of the client and the voice of the regulator and someone to focus on the documents and a forensic specialist, right? I mean, if each of these people are billing on an hourly basis for the matter, it gets really expensive, and the client is going to flinch, I think, at the cost. So I think part of doing this better and doing it right is also getting rid of hourly billing and billing on a kind of value project-based sort of approach. Now that's also something we've been talking about for 25 years, the sort of it's inevitable that we're going to move to, away from hourly billing and into project billing, and we don't. I do think some of that is driven by the dynamics of, the industry. Again, how we pay partners, how we compensate associates. I mean, associate pay is entirely justified internally by number of hours billed by hourly rates, and we see that as, kind of a revenue as the revenue number, and we can tolerate very high costs given that internal logic. So I think that all kind of contributes to this problem. To answer your question, I don't know that there's a simple, easy solution. I keep thinking that as the cost of legal services goes up and up and up, that clients will eventually demand something different. And I think there is, there is a prospect of some regulatory reform that may be responsive to clients demanding something different. I mean, typically, the debate and where folks have had, I think, some success arguing for regulatory change is in access to legal services, but nobody's particularly worried about the Fortune 500's access to legal services. It's more the individual level and different kind of law firm. So, but I do think, and we've chatted about this before, right? There's a lot of interest in this industry. I think there's a fair amount of venture capital and private equity money that is looking for opportunities to disrupt this industry. And I think finding, a slightly open door, particularly around ownership of law firms, and using that as kind of a base to try something very different is a real potential we'll see in the next 3 or 4 years. That's my best guess.
We probably should move on because we could probably geek out on this for another 30 minutes, but I will end with, just this morning, I had a conversation with a client who I had bid on a project basis. As they said, oh, no, we want it hourly so we can control it. And I was like, you know what I was told in 1983? You control the time, you control the amount, but I control the time. And guess what? I just don't get it. But
yeah, we learned about moral hazards in our firms and markets as well. It's a good example of one.
Well, let's move on to governance and ethics, because I know you really enjoyed this module. Why don't you tell us about it, why you enjoyed it so much, and maybe a couple of highlights?
Yeah, so I mean, it was a really great class, and it actually it really brought home for me why I chose Oxford. It was extremely theoretical. So we started the course with, what is ethics? And we talked about Bentham and utilitarianism and Kant and virtue ethics, and we really kind of built from the very the very foundation. We talk about ethics and we talk about our codes of ethics all the time. This course actually really focused on what does it mean to be ethical in a business context, and it was really interesting discussions. Obviously for me as a lawyer and a political theory undergrad, this stuff was like right in my wheelhouse. The thing that really struck me though was how much my classmates really loved it and were engaged and enjoyed it, and it just struck me like you wouldn't expect that from a group of MBAs, to be as captivated by some of these like deep ethical and moral reasoning discussions as they were, and it kind of brought home to me why I think Oxford brings together kind of a different sort of cohort of student, and it was really really rewarding to see not only that to get an opportunity to dig into that stuff, but to see my classmates digging into it and enjoying it and engaging with it. So that was really great. It was really great. I think we did a more in-depth discussion of this issue in our podcast on your ESG network. But one of the things that I really found interesting is the subject of governance and how we go from ethics and sort of a sense of what the corporation says to the world it is and stands for and is about. We call that the meta contract. My professor, Alan Morrison, and his research fellow Rita Moda have sort of developed this concept of this meta contract. This is who we are, what we stand for, what we believe as an organization. These are our promises to the world. To me, the governance piece then, where it's really interesting, is how do you take that and implement it and execute it, and more importantly, when you're a massive, multinational presence with tens of thousands of employees located all over the world, how do you ensure that ethos of your meta contract gets translated into behavior consistent with that day to day, hour to hour, country by country, employee by employee all around the world. So to me, that's super interesting. There's a lot of what we do on the compliance side, Tom. You and I have, spend a lot of time thinking about number one, how do we create a culture where people buy into it and understand what our values are, but then how do we create procedures and processes and controls to make sure that the organization as an organization acts consistently with its meta contract as it moves forward. So those are some of the things that really kind of struck me and worked for me.
You wrote about the Center for Corporate Reputation, and could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is something I discovered, which is really, again, right in my wheelhouse and of great interest to me, that Oxford and the Said Business School has this Center for Corporate Reputation, and it's a research institute focused on, as the name would suggest, on corporate reputation, how organizations develop a reputation, how they deal with threats to it, what can undermine their reputation, how it can be rebuilt after, say, a crisis or something that undermines it. So really interesting work, a lot of research, some teaching. They sponsor a bunch of events and conferences where practitioners and academics talk about these issues, and it's a classic Oxford model of kind of multidisciplinary, bringing together different professionals and academics with different perspectives to sort of talk about this. So I would highly recommend people who are interested in these topics check it out. They have good programs. A lot of it's virtual right now, and I think maybe going forward, I think they've recognized the value of doing some of this virtual, so you don't have to be in Oxford to participate. And it's pretty cool stuff. I think there's some interesting research out there. I'm hoping to delve deeper. I'm hoping to figure out a way to collaborate and dig deeper into this stuff, because it's super interesting to me.
David, I'd like to turn now to some of the social aspects that you've been experiencing in Oxford. How have your classmates continued to be the amazing set of folks you met when you started? What have you found out or found kind of socially to do? What are the pubs like? Any rowing or things that we typically associate with Oxford?
Yeah, so it's been real. I mean, and I think I mentioned this in every podcast, and I'll mention it in this one too, because it's the sort of the core truth to this whole experience. The value is so much in the people, and I have been continued to be impressed by my classmates who, it's been nice. Now we've had 5 modules, and we've been together. More and more people, as the COVID restrictions have been lifted, more and more people are coming to Oxford and spending the week rather than being online, which has been great. I think the last module we were probably at close to 3/4 of the class was there in person, which makes a huge difference. So getting to know people better, getting to have more social time to hear about them, hear about their histories, hear about their businesses, their business interests has been amazing. And the other thing I would say just on the people front is the faculty have been great. And they're accessible, they're open, they're, I think, very interested, or at least they act like they're interested in the MBAs. I think particularly because we all come with professional interests and professional lives that are already pretty fully developed. And so I found the interaction to be really kind of terrific in terms of, figuring out ways to kind of meld the research and the academic piece into the reality of my practice, or my colleagues and some of their more traditional business interests. So that's been great. That's been great. I've also had an opportunity to do a little bit more of Oxford the last couple of times that I've been there. I finally went to the Radcliffe camera. I was able to study a little bit in the Radcliffe camera, which is the picture of Oxford. It's the building that everybody uses is the picture of Oxford, which was pretty cool. The Bodleian Library is amazing. I don't know, Tom, if you've ever been to the Duke Humphreys reading room, which is sort of the oldest, most ornate part of the library. If you haven't done it, you should go. It's really, really amazing. It just you feel like 20% smarter just by walking into the place. So that's been great. The Oxford Union I am a member of. I'm really looking forward to being able to participate in one of the debates. I haven't yet, but I've been able to visit the Oxford Union, and I've been to the bar and hung out there a couple of times. So that's really cool. I have found a favorite pub. It's called the Rickety Press in Jericho, which is not far from where I stay in Oxford, and it's a great place with really good food. Recommend that as well. What else? So spending some time at my college. We talked about this, I think, in the first podcast. I'm a Keble College member. Part of what is part of the value to me of this program is how Oxford, sort of has this matrix system where you're part of a the university, part of a school of business, but also a member of a college. And Keble's been really great. Gives me a place to stay. I eat breakfast a couple of times a module in the classic dining hall, which is spectacular and inspiring. I study in the library, which is spectacular and inspiring. So that's been cool. And yeah, we have been rowing. So one of my classmates, Matthew, has really taken the bull by the horns and has effectively created an EMBA rowing club. So I've been out twice with our cohort. I think as the weather warms up, we're going to be able to get out a little bit more often. We row in the Thames. It's amazing. It's really hard. We're in these 8-person boats, and getting the timing right, and kind of keeping the boat moving in the right direction together is much harder than I ever thought it would be. But it's a lot of fun, and we've really enjoyed it. So those are some of the things that some of the fun things I've been able to experience.
Well, David, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode. But before we go, I was wondering if you might be able to give our listeners just a tease of what you might be studying now that we can talk about in our next episode.
Yeah. So my last course, which I'm still sort of processing and working on the assessment on, was a really interesting subject called Global Rules of the Game, and again sort of fits right within my core interest. A lot of it was sort of on globalization, emerging markets, how non-market forces affect business strategy globally, and working on ways that you can develop non-market strategies to help improve your positioning and your competitive advantage. So that I hope we can dig into that in a little bit more detail next time, because it's pretty interesting stuff. And then our next classes right now, we're halfway through strategy, which also is very interesting. I really like. And in March we start accounting, which I have to say I'm a little anxious about. Not my wheelhouse at all. Less obviously exciting to me than some of the other things. But it'll be good stuff to learn. I mean, I part of my goal in doing this is to, fill in some of the holes in my experience, and that is definitely one of the holes in my experience.
Well, David, as always, this has been great. I feel like I've been able to participate a little bit in your adventure, and I'm sure many of our listeners feel the same way. I can't wait till we get together in the next quarter or so to find out your next series of adventures. So until then, look forward to the next time.
Thanks. Looking forward to it.
This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of A Yank at Oxford with David Simon, where we detailed his journey in getting an MBA at Oxford. There's a couple of podcast series I'd like to highlight for you. The first one is The Trial of the Century, the Enron trial, where with Lauren Steffi, who actually covered the trial as a business columnist for the Houston Chronicle, we detail what happened at the Enron trial. It's not an exploration of the bankruptcy and demise of Enron. It's focused on the trial. It's a great series, and I know you will enjoy it. That is on the Compliance Podcast Network. Also coming up, Taxman, on the intersection of tax and compliance. In this series, I explore with tax expert Tracy Howell what's the role of tax in compliance and what's the role of compliance in tax. Turns out there's a lot more integration than most compliance officers are aware of. So if you are interested in this intersection of tax and compliance, check out Taxman on the Compliance Podcast Network. It premieres on Monday, March 14th. Finally, if you've ever wanted to start a podcast or have an idea for a podcast, please give me a call. I'd love to visit with you and see if I can get you on the Compliance Podcast Network. A Yank in Oxford is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.